Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it is my great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all of you joining us today. I hope everyone is safe in these challenging times. We are particularly pleased to host this event with our UNFCCC colleagues. The climate challenges require strong international cooperation at all fronts, and our concerted action amplify our collective abilities and impact. As we continue to respond and seek to recover from the ongoing COVID pandemic, it will be imperative that we align the short-term COVID recovery efforts with the medium and long-term objective of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Agenda. This has been an essential message for IRENA since the beginning of the crisis. IRENA's vision for recovery is embedded in our global renewable outlook, which set out the energy transition pathway to 2050. The science is clear. We need to decarbonize energy if we are to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. A fundamental pillar for achieving net zero emission will be strategic planning, integrating country-specific consideration to come up with a balanced mix of electrification with renewables, bioenergy, and green hydrogen to reach net zero emission in the coming decades. Today, IRENA is releasing a new report entitled Green Hydrogen Cost Reduction, Scaling Up Electrolyzer to Meet the 1.5 Celsius Climate Goal. We hope this report can be useful for informing the development of the decarbonization scenario. We see a growing number of countries embarking on such pathway and are announcing pledges to zero emission from mid-century onward. Countries are not alone in this. The net zero approach is becoming a movement for cities, companies, and regions. Let me be clear. This will be a monumental effort that will require not only a clarity of vision, but also a sound strategy that fits national circumstances and allows for an orderly transition. Most of all, such a strategy must ensure that nobody is left behind. To help countries achieve their objective, IRENA has been actively engaged in supporting our global membership on navigating the energy transition through technical assistance, analytical works, and now more action on the ground. Among many work streams, IRENA's long-standing body of work on energy planning and scenario has gained a new meaning with the pressing need to align recovery measures with climate objectives. IRENA's long-term scenario network has provided a global platform for scenario developers and planners to exchange experience on how to improve their long-term scenario. One of the key findings of the discussion within the network was that raising global climate ambitions require alignment of long-term energy scenarios with the objectives of the Paris Agreement and climate strategies stipulated in the NDCs. IRENA shared the view that the UNFCCC, that the energy and climate communities must work together towards the common goal of sustainable prosperity. UNFCCC gathers the largest climate community and leads the global discussion on climate change. IRENA gathers the largest renewable energy community and leads the global conversation on the energy transition. Co-hosting this event is a testimony to our commitment to working together and uniting our efforts. In this meeting, we will discuss how to move from political ambition to country-level pathways, and how long-term energy scenario can be cornerstone to building more robust long-term development strategies aligned with net zero targets. We will hear from countries which have successfully integrated their energy and climate agendas. I'm in delight that Spain, the United Kingdom, Chile, and the EU, which have been front runners in developing long-term net zero strategies, will share their experience here today. We will also hear the perspective of technical institutions that are supporting governments to develop net zero scenario. Based on the insights from this meeting, IRENA intends to work closely with UNFCCC and help countries to align LTES better to the UNFCCC long-term low emission and development strategies process. Thank you very much and good work.
Thank you very much, Director General La Cámara, for your opening remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we give you a warm welcome to this virtual seminar organized by IRENA and the UNFCCC on planning with net zero scenarios, moving from political ambition to country level pathways. I would like now to welcome Ovais Sarmad, Deputy Executive Secretary of UNFCCC, to give welcoming remarks.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Just want to make sure that you can hear me. Great. And it's a great pleasure to see and to join you, Mr. Camera, dear Francesco, a great friend for UNFCCC, and I bring greetings from our Executive Secretary, who unfortunately could not join today. What I'd like to share is that this event is extremely timely, and there is absolutely no question that bringing the world to a net zero carbon emission state is extremely important. Collaboration between the energy and climate communities is critical to achieving that goal, and that goal as it's inscribed in the Paris Agreement. Collaboration with IRENA and our organization, our secretariat, is a crucial part of that. There is no question about the need to make a rapid and global transition to net zero emissions. Catastrophic fires and storms coupled with unprecedented temperatures show us that the climate crisis is happening now. Just look at Fiji today. The recent UNEP emissions gap report finds that despite a brief dip in the carbon dioxide emission caused by the current pandemic, the world is still heading for a temperature rise in excess of 3 degrees this century, and that would present a very catastrophic situation. What we need to do is to remain below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees as it's the goal of Paris Agreement. We will only achieve that success by taking urgent action, completing the tasks of the Paris Agreement, tabling robust NDCs and continuing to build climate ambition, including an unprecedented transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. We see encouraging signs of progress. 75 leaders from throughout the world outlined new commitments at the recent Climate Ambition Summit last Saturday at the occasion of the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement, which continues to be the beacon for increased climate action and ambition. By next year, we expect countries representing around 65% of global carbon emissions and around 70% of the world's economy to have committed to net zero emissions or carbon neutrality. IRENA's recent Global Renewables Outlook report indicates that investment in an energy system fit for the 21st century could push jobs in the renewable sector to 42 million by 2050. It also notes that this could result in a GDP growth of 2.4%, amounting to a cumulative gain of $98 trillion by mid-century. So these are extremely positive signals, and it's clear that a renewables-based energy transition needs to be part of all stimulus and recovery plans as nations build forward from the current pandemic. It is an unprecedented opportunity to define long-term clean energy goals and back them with the right enabling policies and market incentives, all of which must be incorporated in the national climate action plans or the nationally determined contributions. Developing long-term low greenhouse gas emissions development strategies has to be an integral part of all countries' climate action. They can place the indices into the context of long-term planning and development priorities. They can inform short and medium-term political and economic cycles. They can provide political certainty for bold actions by private sector as well as financial and investment sectors. To date, some 26 countries have submitted their long-term strategies to UNFCCC. And I'm pleased to say that IRENA continues to play an extremely important role in this effort. Your long-term strategy, energy scenarios are important tools for policymakers as they map their strategies and as they plan a clean energy transformation. This is very much needed. We know that in the past, the dialogue between energy planners at the national level and overall climate community has not always been ideal, but we can't afford this. In order to make the energy transition we must see greater compatibility and alignment between those two stakeholders. And your work, IRENA, is extremely important and crucial in strengthening that. Dear colleagues, as we have seen, long-term energy scenarios can provide energy sector targets in successive NDCs, as well as realistic national policy pathways to reach them, all set against the backdrop of overall goal of net zero emissions. But to get there, we need clear, carefully planned implementation roadmaps. Such clarity has the potential to increase emission reductions in the energy sector while at the same time building climate action. This will send a clear signal for those in private sector and the investment community to do the same. We're already seeing this through our Race to Zero campaign. The campaign has mobilized an amazing amount of coalition, leading to zero initiatives representing 454 cities, 23 regions, almost 1,400 businesses, 74 of the biggest investors, and 569 universities to lead the way for a healthy, resilient, carbon-neutral recovery that prevents future threats, create decent jobs, and unlocks inclusive and sustainable growth. Collectively, this is extremely important. All of those areas now cover almost 25% of the carbon emissions and over 50% of the global GDP. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, we are all pulling in one direction under the Paris Agreement, and I know we all want more climate ambition and climate action. Our secretaries and we all look forward to the outcomes of this event as part of the process towards building a successful platform for COP26 next year and beyond. And we welcome the COP opportunity to continue to engage and collaborate as we already do with IRENA long-term strategy network with the aim of enhancing engagement between climate change and energy policy makers at every level. To pull all this in the same direction means taking care of the details, being aligned, ensuring we all understand the pathways we must follow. Let us continue to build those pathways and build a clean, green, healthy future for all people. Once again, Francesca, thank you very much for this opportunity to contribute our views and thoughts. And last but not least, I wish you all safety, security in these troubled times, and a very happy holiday season as we enter into Christmas and New Year. All the best, and I hope to see you all soon again.
Thank you both, Director. Thank you both, Director General La Cámara and Deputy Executive Secretary Sarmad. That was both inspiring and encouraging to hear the focus on the importance of net zero pathways and the integration of energy and climate agendas to tackle multiple objectives of economic recovery and sustainable development. But let's move back to the meeting for today. IRENA is co-organizing this event with the UNFCCC. IRENA is an intergovernmental organization that supports countries in their transition to a sustainable energy future and serves as the principal platform for international cooperation, a center for excellence, and a repository of policy, technology, resource, and financial knowledge on renewable energy. The UNFCCC is the international environmental treaty addressing climate change and seeking the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic human-induced interference with the Earth's climate system. Topic IRENA and UNFCCC bring to you today is highly relevant, concerning both energy and climate communities in their ambition to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. We have the objective to discuss how to move beyond political statements into realizable country-level, long-term scenarios and strategies. But before I dive into the agenda for today, let me mention some of the housekeeping items. There is a Q&A section, and we invite all attendees to post your questions to our panelists there. Please mention which panel discussion and/or panelist your question relates to. We will be monitoring questions throughout the event and select a few. Due to time constraints, we apologize in advance if your question is not answered. We will use all questions to inform further discussions. You can also use the function to introduce yourself and let us know where you tune in from. This is a public event. It is being recorded. The recording will be available on demand in a public domain. Please note, therefore, that Chatham House rules do apply to these discussions. The agenda for today is as follows. We have heard already the welcoming remarks from IRENA and UNFCCC. Up next, we have a pre-recorded message from Her Excellency Teresa Rivera, Deputy Prime Minister for the Ecological Transition in Spain. After the video, we have two presentations. First, a keynote presentation from Professor Priyadarshi Shukla, co-chair of Working Group 3 at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This will be followed by a scene-setting presentation from Dr. Dolph Gielen, Director of the Innovation and Technology Center at IRENA, who will set the scene for the following panel discussions. We will have then two panel discussions. Panel 1 on national experience on integrating energy and climate perspectives, and panel 2 on international experience with net zero scenarios, aligning long-term low-emission development strategies, or LTES, and long-term energy scenarios, LTES. After both panels, we will have a short round of key takeaways from our panelists and speakers, and we will end the event with closing remarks by Dolph Gielen from IRENA. Now, we will hear a special video address from Teresa Rivera, Deputy Prime Minister for Ecological Transition of Spain. Minister Rivera has led the development of Spain's integrated energy and climate plan, which was released at the beginning of 2020. And just a few days ago, Spain submitted to the UNFCCC its long-term decarbonization strategy, aiming for a modern, competitive, and carbon-neutral Spanish economy by 2050. Her Excellency Rivera was not able to attend the program, but has been kind to share a pre-recorded message for us. Let us share her words with you now.
The combination of the climate and energy agendas, the climate and energy planning tools, is key to respond to the main challenges we have in front of us, including the identification of the main opportunities we need to take off with us. I think that this is not something that is new. There are many countries where the climate and energy responsibilities in the government belong to the same person, to the same ministry. But I think that it is very important to take the full lessons out of these messages. When we combine climate, environment, energy, industry, innovation and research, we can count on a much more sound understanding on what are the challenges we need to overcome, the barriers that we need to overcome. This is what we try to do when combining energy and climate in the scenarios to come, both to design the energy policies and the climate adaptation and resilience initiatives. This also provides a very good sound to understand what are the main social challenges and risks that we need to face and anticipate in order to provide sound responses to people that may be suffering out of the climate change impacts in their day-to-day life. More important than that, we count on some very important tools that help us to design this type of measures and policy responses. The deep decarbonization pathways, something we have been working on for a very long time, something I had the great pleasure to learn from my colleagues in IDRI, but also in many European and non-European countries thinking on what their long-term strategies may look like. It's a very interesting tool to get some distance, to identify what are the goals, the targets we want to achieve by 2050, and what are the different possible pathways combining the different domestic priorities in order to provide sound pathways to achieve these final goals. This allows a proper mapping on opportunities, challenges and barriers. This also allows a good ground for discussion, public debate on how to combine and accelerate the different combinations of measures. This also allows us to identify what are the main sound solutions that could be of interest both for researchers but also for investors. So it's a much more healthy investments pathway for anyone willing to invest in our countries. This also provides a very good role as a catalyzer tool to facilitate other policy decisions such as education, research, urban decision or infrastructures all around the territories, including the green infrastructure solutions. I think that these are elements that come even stronger when thinking about the recovery from the COVID pandemics. Now we are trying to identify how to create prosperity, how to recover the economies, how to create employment, how to provide the social demands that people that are suffering in addition because of the pandemics are asking to the institutions and governments. And this is something that should be responded in a very consistent manner, taking into consideration the IPCC alignments, taking into consideration our commitments to the international agenda, but also taking into consideration these references to equity, to justice, not just between generations, but also between the human beings that are living at the very same time that we are living today. So identifying and accelerating these transformations will be a key response. And this year, 2021, that is going to start in a very few days, is going to be a key year to reorientate all our development trends within the planetary boundaries, but also all to spread all the knowledge we have been growing up during the last decades around the different approaches to count on a very sound, reliable energy system that provides welfare to anyone.
That was a message from Deputy Prime Minister Rivera from Spain. May I remind our audience that Spain will be chairing IRENA's General Assembly in January as well. So without any further ado, we will move right into the keynote and presentation part of this event. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Priyadarshi Shukla. Professor Shukla currently holds the position of co-chair for IPCC Working Group 3 on mitigation and is a distinguished professor and the chair of the Global Center for Environmental and Energy at the Ahmedabad University of India. He's a leading researcher working on scenario building, modeling of socioeconomic developments, climate change, energy, and environment. Welcome, Professor Shukla. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pablo. It's my great pleasure to be working with IRENA to make this presentation. I'm going to present today from the IPCC's iconic report, what is called the special report on 1.5 degrees, and show that how this report has, and also the analysis in the report has taken us towards to give a kind of new ideas behind the net zero scenarios, a kind of political ambition, and also the country level pathways. Next. Right, so this slide is a highly scientific slide and very much discussed that before we start talking about the human emissions that would have been accumulated since nearly a couple of hundred years, before going into the future ambitions that we could have and the future emissions that one would have, one would want to have a clear understanding of what is actually happening since the past about couple of hundred years to the emissions and how they have grown. So this is the iconic chart of one of the chart of the 1.5 report. And in this, actually, one is very simply only measuring how the temperature has grown since about 1850 to about 2020, about a period of about 170 years. And as you can see that the answer that we get from various evidences that are there and the scientific methods of computing, this find that the human emissions as measured now from the about 170 odd years back to today has increased by about 1.5 degrees centigrade and 1.2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels in 2020, and using the special report 1.5 methods. Now that is where the science is there. Well, what does the science tell us? 1.5 degrees C and 1.2 degrees already happened over the last about 200 odd years. And so the space now left to get into the ideas like the net zero and others that has already shrunk. And so one wants to look at what would be the way to go about the implementing now the ideas like the net zero, especially, and the ambitions which are there behind that. How do we show that this is still feasible and not only feasible, actually, that one can even do a better than next. Right. So this is now. I'm starting with this particular slide, which shows on the left side 1960 to about 2020 that nearly about 1.2 degrees, which has already increased. The question now, which was put up around and the Paris Agreement, that in the 2017, if the number that we got about the human-induced temperature coming from 1960 onward, and have taken that the tail, which is a light yellow tail, the question that we want to address now has been that well, how in future this past emissions are going to be treated, so that actually that we can get into a safer a world of our ambition of 1.5 degrees and more. And so in this case, the IPCC method looks at this a very simple idea that now we have already reached in 2017, and this is now about 2020. If we start looking at it into now getting into the future from the past, where only about 1.1 to or 1.2 degrees centigrade space is left out, one can look at the various possibilities which exist into the future. So for instance, actually this iconic figure has a very simple understanding like this, that you look at the top side of here we are looking at the three different scenarios, and the lowest scenario where if the interventions would be started early into the atmosphere to reduce the greenhouse gases, then one would be in a band which could be a somewhat like the blue band, and then that if you miss out on that and do a little more of the emissions, and then one will have a kind of another pathways which are the purple type of the pathways in as you can see in the D, and the pathway which is the kind of the presentation here would show that this would have something like a blue band. So now we have three future worlds. One is covered by these blue lines, the another is covered by the gray lines, and the another one which is encompassing the a purple type of a figure. Then it's very clear actually that the purple figure is permitting actually a lot more greenhouse gas emissions as compared to actually the emissions which are coming under this a kind of a blue band. And within that, now the idea would be that well, how we can achieve that 1.5 degrees. Now you can see that in this case, the left hand side on the axis is a temperature as such, and on the bottom we have the time period as such. Next. And so we come down to this actually that well, okay, if we have we look at the emissions which are happening today. Now we are now entering actually into the world where we have the emissions on the vertical axis, and in the horizontal axis there is also the emissions which would be, but on the lower axis actually the time is the one. So the idea of this is that well, if you were looking into the at 2018 or 2019 actually, that is the current period as such, if we want to get to a net zero, then the lines have to fall down, that is emissions have to fall down at a very, very high speed. And you will have scenarios which are the three scenarios which we saw from the previous slide actually, that works that well, that there's so much more the emissions will have to be relegated to get a kind of net zero in the zone of 2040 and 2055. And within that, the idea that well, the emissions are not the ones which one has to manage, but actually the cumulative emissions is what matters. And so that's the chart C. And then the chart D over here is that well, it's not only the carbon dioxide alone which which requires targeting for mitigation. The reductions of the other gases, which also includes the greenhouse gases like the methane, and other gases like the nitrogen oxide and others. If we get these into the play further, then we understand better actually that well, on one hand, the carbon dioxide would be is declining by the various measures. The treaties that are being made are also covering the overall the aggregate or the combined greenhouse gases which would be coming out into the future, and also how to curb the non-CO2 radiative forcing, which is from the 2030 and going beyond actually, because the current agreements are not including the non-CO2 radiative forcing. So this is a kind of a broad idea of looking at that, well, how can we reach the 1.5 degree world? As such, from where the current emissions are going in another direction as such. Next. So this is a part of the iconic figure of the IPCC 1.5 report actually. Somebody can ask that question that okay, now that if the temperature is 1 degree or 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, what does it matter? And so this figure essentially just shows that actually that various studies which has happened actually from the adaptation and the impacts work of the IPCC, right? That well, the warm water corals and those kind of areas, but one would find that well, there is a very huge damage, even if you are at the level at 1 degree or below. And so at 1.5 degrees, actually, there is a huge damages which are happening. And so similarly, in different managed and human systems also, and also the unmanaged but all the select or natural systems which are there. And so the question is that this slide is essentially connecting back with the 1.5 slides, that it is not only a question only of emissions, but really understanding that well, even letting 1.5 degree remain, then how much would be the damages which would be coming out. Next. All right, and so this I just come towards the last slide here. So from this that the general discussions over the last a decade or so, since this the very low targets, like also starting from the Paris Agreement and this and so one of the way of looking at, and that's why what one is doing is that it's very difficult sometimes to think that well, within a very short period one would be able to have a large number of scenarios which would not cross that 1.5 degree target. And so in this case, actually, there is a lot of discussion and within the IPCC's work also would find that well, what you will be getting is that well, there is an overshoot scenarios, that in between some period you miss out in bringing your emissions to below 1.5 degrees, in which case and you get it down after some time, what would be the additional losses that one would have. And so one would find that there are annual emissions to be measured there, the cumulative emissions, the time integrated impacts, and all these then at the very end, when we look at what is what the IRENA is doing, essentially what IRENA's IRENA's work is on the long-term temperature goal, which is and then this would depend upon the long-term low emissions and development strategy and the long-term energy scenarios. Now, these two major programs of IRENA that we hear about actually connects with every such a phenomena which happens with the incongruences which could happen, and then how to measure on this. One could say that actually that in this case the delays would be approximately something of the order of about 220 gigaton of CO2 of removals would be needed to address an overshoot of 0.1. And so an overshoot of 0.1, which you believe actually that I can go a little bit up from 1.5 and then I will bring it down and recover the losses back or something. Well, this is not the case actually. And what one would find that even if the overshoot of 0.1 is going to be with the sacrifice of 220 a gigaton of carbon dioxide of removals. And so, well, these are the challenging questions which the IRENA might have to take, or the researchers who are working on this. Okay? And so, next. So, let me close here, and let me thank you for and inviting me to speak at this very august forum. Thank you very much, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shukla, for this great overview on the science of climate change and the global emission scenarios towards 1.5 and net zero. Very insightful. Next is Dr. Dolph Gielen, Director of the Innovation and Technology Center at IRENA. Since 2011, Dr. Gielen has overseen IRENA's work on advising member countries on energy scenarios and planning, power sector transformation, cost and markets, technology status and innovation outlooks, and project development guidelines. Dolph, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pablo. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll give you a bit of an overview of the progress we've made with the LTES network, Long-Term Energy Scenarios Network, and how that can be used for the long-term low emissions and development strategies. So I can have my slide. Okay, thank you. So there are, of course, many energy scenarios, long-term energy scenarios around that have been successfully deployed for decades, both at the national level and at the global level. And here are some examples of recent such studies. What is different now is the need for clean energy transition and even transformation scenarios, which is something slightly different from the scenarios, energy scenarios, as we have seen in the past. Professor Shukla just clearly explained the need for decarbonization by mid-century. And at the climate summit last Saturday, as we heard, many leaders have come with new commitments in that direction. And you've also seen the recent announcements of various countries. So while there is a clarity where we need to go long term, and there is a political commitment to go there, it's not yet so clear how we're going to achieve that. And the scenarios and models to develop these scenarios will play a critical role in operationalizing that. Another aspect is that, and as Teresa Rivera also mentioned, it's not only energy scenarios we're talking, it's really energy transformation scenarios. These scenarios need to be socially and economically acceptable, and there's a great demand from policymakers to assess these aspects in greater detail. We've done that as part of a global renewables outlook. We look into the socioeconomics, such as jobs and GDP impacts, but we also get questions from other studies. So we work with the majority of 162 countries on energy scenarios, and the issues of the socioeconomic impacts come up regularly as a key aspect. If we move to the next slide, so our mental model, if you like, is that the long-term energy scenarios are a key input to the long-term energy policy making, and they can draw on energy modeling tools. And this whole process, the involvement of stakeholders is critical. And in fact, it's not so much a linear process, but more of a cycle, because there is not a single true scenario at the end. Scenarios are a way to deal with uncertainty, and as new information comes in all the time, you need to revisit the scenarios, and also as the policy questions change, you need to revisit these scenarios. So it's a continuous process. In the context of energy transition, for example, flexibility of power systems is critical as we ramp up renewables and power generation, but also there's increasing attention now for issues around sector coupling. So how to decarbonize buildings, transport, and industry, which is also new, relatively new topics. Next slide, please. So we have been working on establishing a network around this for some time. It started out with a long-term energy scenarios campaign in the context of the Clean Energy Ministerial that has been very successful. In fact, it's currently being upgraded into an initiative, a more permanent initiative. And we're currently 13 countries and 7 institutions participate. But we wanted to make it very accessible to all our membership. So that's why we started the long-term energy scenarios network that is open to all countries, and where a much broader set of countries have engaged. We look at how to enhance scenarios for energy transition, how to enhance the use of these scenarios for policy making, and how to improve the institutional capacity building for energy scenario use and development. So these are the 3 key aspects. And from the discussions, we already got some insights around importance of good governance, to the need to expand the boundaries, for example, the socioeconomics that I mentioned, the need to be clear about the purpose of the scenarios and the transparency of the process, and to build the right type of scenarios, scenario building capacity within governments. And all of these have been documented. You can find the more detail on our website. Move to the next slide. So what comes up from so we've had about 30 meetings now comparing scenarios from around the world, and what comes out from that. So for example, we had a recent meeting jointly organized with the European Commission Joint Research Center around benchmarking of scenarios. And in fact, it was an event about benchmarking the benchmarking process for scenarios. So how do you compare scenarios? And there were some interesting insights that came out from that. For example, that there's a broad agreement on certain aspects of a successful energy transition, that there are other aspects where some scenarios indicated that they're important, some scenarios are not so sure. So this type of information can already help policymakers in where to focus and how to treat certain aspects of the transition. Now, moving to the next slide, the formulation of the long-term energy and emission and development strategies. So there are 3 aspects to that: declaration of intent, vision and pathway development, and the exploration of outcomes. If you go to the UNFCCC site, it was mentioned, you can find 26 such country analysis there. And 12 of these are very recent from this year. But that's only a start. because there's around 195 countries around the world. So many more countries will need this type of background also to support their NDCs. So there will be over the coming years a continuous need to further develop and refine these. Next slide, please. Now, one aspect I wanted to highlight is how to use and how to develop scenarios. There is a need to ensure the consistency between the long-term scenarios and the shorter-term NDCs, so the 2050 outlook for decarbonization and 2030 targets. There's a need to establish a consensus and to have the buy-in into these scenarios. So the stakeholder process is very important. And as I already mentioned, the socioeconomic aspects are critical. If you move to the next slide, and that's my last slide, about the how to build the capacity in the governments and what should be the role of governments in this scenario development. There are different visions on that. Here you see the overview of where some of the countries how they have set this up. In some countries, the scenario building is sourced in. It takes place within the government. For example, in Chile, in Mexico, and in the UAE. In some countries, it's completely outsourced, such as in Finland and in Germany. And some countries have an interim type of approach. So it depends a little bit on what you're trying to achieve, how strong the capacities are, how it's done, and you need to look at various aspects to decide which is the right way to approach this in a country context. So in conclusion, important synergies between long-term energy scenarios and the low emission and development strategies, and we look forward to further strengthen that going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dolph, on emphasizing the keywords and views relevant for this meeting. IRENA's LTES network, also the need not for only energy scenarios, but energy transformation scenarios, and the connection to low emission development strategies. Thank you very much. With that, we conclude our presentation segment, and now we can move on to the first panel discussion. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our first chair for the first panel, Dr. Asami Miketa, who is a Senior Program Officer in Power System Investment Planning at IRENA, and also leads IRENA's long-term energy scenario network. But before I hand it to Asami, please don't forget to use the Q&A function to ask questions to our speakers. And now, Asami, over to you.
Thank you, Pablo. So today in this first panel, we have three distinguished speakers representing three governments: United Kingdom, Chile, and European Commission. And we are very happy to have these three governments because we have been working with these three governments under the framework of LTES network since the beginning, and they've been actively contributing to the activities. And through the dialogues under the LTES campaign and network, we have learned how the countries are using these scenarios and developing scenarios. And we invited these three governments as we believe that we can learn from the way that they are integrating energy and climate agendas into a coherent strategy. We look forward to hearing how they use long-term energy scenarios to devise the long-term strategy for low emission development and how they govern the planning structure. So I would like to invite three speakers, just briefly introduce each of them. So from the United Kingdom, we have Mr. Tim Lode, who is the Director for Clean Growth at the Department of Business, Energy, Industry Strategy, which is also known as BASE. He leads the work of the department to deliver emission reduction while seizing the economic benefit of the low carbon transition. Also, the BASE hosts the Secretariat of the UK Presidency for the upcoming COP. Welcome, Mr. Lode. And the second speaker is from Chile. We have a pleasure of having Mr. Carlos Barria, who is the head of the Studies and Policy Division of the Ministry of Energy. Mr. Barria has been in charge of long-term energy planning, including the development of green hydrogen strategy and promote carbon neutrality in the sector. And finally, from the European Commission, we have Mr. Hans van Steen, Acting Director on Renewables, Research, Innovation and Energy Efficiency in the Directorate General for Energy. Among many responsibilities he has, he was responsible for the introduction of EU's first renewable energy directives in 2009, setting EU target of 20% renewable energy target for 2020. And in his current role, he oversees the review of the EU's renewable energy and energy efficiency policies, as well as the inputs on energy efficiency and renewable energy in the long-term energy scenarios that has been supporting EU's 2030 and 2050 climate targets. So now I would like to start with asking a question. Okay, so I would like to first ask you to introduce to us briefly what are the recent achievements of your respective governments as regards to the long-term strategy for low emission development. May I start with Mr. Lode, please?
Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great event, and I think while as the previous presentations have showed, there's no doubt about the scale of the climate crisis or the pace of it. I think events like this and the progress that we've made, both domestically and internationally in the last few weeks, give a lot of optimism, I hope, as we head into a critically important year. So in terms of recent achievements and the link to long-term emission reduction strategies, I think from a UK perspective, there are probably 5 things that I would briefly highlight. So the first is on targets. So we cannot underestimate the critical importance of ambitious targets. So we're very proud, obviously, that we set a net zero target quite early in this process, back in June last year. But we also have our interim carbon budgets and legislated budgets, which take us in 5-year chunks down to the 2050 target. And we've also, as you'll have seen in the last couple of weeks, increased the ambition of our NDC very significantly to at least 68% by 2030. And certainly in terms of driving action within country, we have found that those targets and domestic law in place to enforce those targets has been really critically important in terms of driving action and making sure this is a priority across government as opposed to simply energy and environment ministries. I think the second point is obviously the links between climate and energy policy is one of the things that we're discussing today, but even more important than that.
Excuse me, Mr. Lode. We have problem hearing you.
Ambitious targets. Last year, but we also have our.
Hello, Mr. Lode.
Okay. Yep. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, the voice was a bit broken, so maybe it's better to do without video for now. Hello? Okay, so we might have lost Mr. Lode. So while he will establish the connection, can I ask Mr. Barria? Welcome, Mr. Barria. Can I ask you the same question? What's the major achievement of your government with respect to the low carbon emission strategy development?
Yeah, thank you, Asami, and thank you, IRENA and the organizers of this event. You can hear me good? Yes?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to share Chile's reflections on our energy transition, our energy policy, and our planning work. Last year, Chile committed to phasing out all coal-fired power plants by 2040. Today, coal production is the 40% of the electricity generation. For us, it's a great ambition. And last year too, as well, we achieving carbon neutrality. We want to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. These are two of our main commitments for the climate crisis. As a result, we have the challenge of incorporating massive amounts of solar and wind power, expanding storage capacity, increasing adoption of electromobility, and the development of a green hydrogen market to meet these goals. Today, Chile renewable energy accounts for 45% of the power generation, mostly hydro, solar, and wind power, and we expect it to reach 70% by 2030 and 90% or 95% by 2050. In this way, we are working on this clean energy transition with a number of significant energy policy initiatives, undertaking important regulatory reforms and releasing crucial national strategies. The most prominent for us of these strategies is the National Green Hydrogen Strategy announced last November. This strategy lays out a roadmap for Chile to scale up the domestic production of hydrogen produced through renewable generated electricity before eventually expanding the capacity to export low-cost green hydrogen to international partners. One of our goals in this strategy is that by 2030, Chile aims to have 25 gigawatts of installed electrolyzers to become one of the top 3 leading exporters of green hydrogen worldwide, shipping approx $2.5 billion each year at the lowest cost globally of under $1.5 kilogram. These are large numbers, constituting an even larger ambition, but Chile is committed to developing this new industry that will be a catalyst for local growth and human capital investment, as well as play a crucial role in reducing our domestic greenhouse gas emissions by up to 20%, and aiding other economies as well around the world in reducing their own emissions. We're working in another policies as we have launched last August a power system flexibility strategy. We are working on the regulations about the operation and the transmission planning of the power system, all in the way to permit so the integration of great amounts of renewable energy so that it can be developed safely, efficiently, and sustainable. On the other hand, electromobility also plays an important role in our decarbonization pathway. Furthermore, thanks to our national electromobility strategy with the objective of total electrification of public transportation by the year 2040, we currently have the largest fleet of electric buses outside of China. So our way to net zero ambitions and the use of long-term scenarios to assess and build this commitment are very, very important for us.
Thank you very much. It's always inspiring to hear from how Chile has been enhancing the ambition for the renewable energy. It's been really showing great example to the world. Thank you very much. So now I would like to ask the same question, Mr. Hans von Steen, to highlight some of the achievement of the European Commission with regards to the development of low emission strategy.
Thank you very much for having me today on this important event. I'm really very happy to share a little bit the experience from the European Union. I hope you can hear me and see me okay. At least I can hear you very well, Asami, and I also heard Carlos very well in the beginning, whereas I had a slight problem with Mr. Lord. But anyway, I'm very happy to be here. I think the most important thing to say is, first of all, is that the EU has committed to complete carbon neutrality by the middle of this century. So by 2050, there should be no carbon emissions, CO2 emissions in the entire economy. Now, this is, of course, a very ambitious objective, and it's also something that is impacting enormously on the energy sector, because energy, as we know, is about 75% of the emissions in the EU. In order to meet those objectives, long-term energy scenarios are really very, very important because of this very strong connection between energy and climate. They also played a really important role in the targets which we have already set ourselves for 2030 when it comes to renewable energy and energy efficiency. For 2030, we have agreed with all the member states in the EU to reach a share of 32% renewable energy by 2030. So that is ambitious, but we have very recently, on the basis of additional scenario work, looked at how does these targets actually match our ambition to be climate neutral by 2050. And there it's quite clear that these targets are insufficient. They go together with a greenhouse gas emission reduction of 40%, which is what the EU pleaded initially in the Paris Agreement. And we did a lot of modeling work to see how that worked out together with the objective of being climate neutral. And it's quite clear that 40% is insufficient. It's not bringing us on the right path towards climate neutrality. So therefore, we've very recently proposed, and I'm very happy to say that the member states have agreed to a 55% reduction of CO2 emissions by 2030. And that, of course, also has implications for renewable energy and energy efficiency. And that's why we have committed, the President of the Commission, Mrs. Ursula von der Leyen, has committed to review the targets and the legislation we have for both energy efficiency and renewable energy by already June of next year. That will be part of a bigger package. We call it Fit for 55, and that is not referring to the age of the people who are preparing these proposals, but the 55% greenhouse gas emission reductions that we need to reach by 2030. And that package will also have in it other pieces of legislation, for example, on energy taxation, on the emission trading scheme, on emissions from land use, and so on and so forth, as well as certain parts of the transport sector that are, of course, also important emissions. I think I can perhaps share a couple of experiences that we have. If I still have time, Asami, I'm a little bit in your hands there. I can share some experience that we have on the modeling work we've done to achieve these commitments. And I should say, by the way, that of course these are targets that member states sign up to, but then of course it's the Commission's role, so the institution for which I work, to make sure that they also live up to those targets, that they're actually reaching the targets. And the initial targets are actually for 2020, so basically for now. And we are right now in the process of checking whether the member states are reaching the targets which we set out some 10 years ago for the period up till now. And the good news for renewables is that largely they are, with one or two exceptions, and I'm not going to mention any particular member state here, but overall the EU is on track to meet its target for renewable energy for 2020, which was also set on the basis of modeling work. A little bit more difficult on energy efficiency, but since we are in an IRENA context today, maybe we can focus on the good news, which is on the renewables, where indeed we are more or less on track. Anyway, let me say a couple of words about the experience that we have with modeling and long-term scenarios. I think, first of all, it's very important, and I think Dolph said that also in his introduction, that it is very important to look at energy and climate together. We need to really be able to see how this involves also sectors outside of energy, for example, forestry, biodiversity, including, of course, the use of bioenergy, which is a very important source of renewable energy also in the EU. We also need to look at how does consumer behavior impact energy consumption, and all these things you can do with these modeling operations. Secondly, and I think Dolph mentioned that as well, it has to be clear that this should be a continuous process. We have been using modeling in the EU for quite some time now, and we very regularly have to update the data, including, for example, new data related to the cost of renewables, because that, of course, makes a lot of difference, because, of course, modeling is only the output of modeling is only as good as the input, as we all know. It also requires a continuous engagement with the stakeholders, including publication of the results. So you involve stakeholders and they put in their views on and their information about data. It's also important that they are informed about what actually comes out of the modeling. Secondly, it's important that you think about what you're using the modeling for. I mean, you can use it for many different things. For example, to assess our long-term objectives for climate neutrality in 2050, we focused on different technology pathways to show the technical and also the socio-economic feasibility of different ways of decarbonizing our economies. Whereas in the assessment of the 2030 target that I was just talking about, we've used the long-term energy scenarios to evaluate the impacts of different policy options on the cost effectiveness of achieving such increased ambition. Another lesson we've learned is that you need to have a review of these scenarios, and we review them regularly with the member states, because it's very important to create trust and create a common understanding and a common baseline for future energy and climate planning. And then I think we need also to say that it's good to have independent analysis, because many stakeholder groups will present their own scenarios and results, and it's important to have an evidence base from which you can compare the different inputs that you receive. So there has to be an element of independent analysis in all of this. I will probably leave it there. It's maybe a lot of information there to take in, but just basically to sum up, for us, it is really, really important. And without these long-term scenarios, we would never have been able to convince 28, soon 27 governments across the EU to sign up to important new policies and to sign up, for example, to targets for renewable energy. So it's important that we are able to carry out this work, and that this work is generally seen as useful and helpful in that context. Thank you. I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you so much for elaborating how you are using scenarios for this decision making. I also wanted to come back to the point on this scenario use in the context of Chile, because Chile is also very strong in using scenarios. But I understand, before going to Chile, I understand that Mr. Lode is back. Are you with us, Mr. Lode?
I am, yes.
Okay, thank you for coming back. Now I hope the technical issue is resolved. So can I ask you to briefly summarize the latest achievement of the UK government in terms of the development of the long-term strategy for low emission development?
Yes, of course. Thank you. And apologies, I'm going to keep my camera off after my my Wi-Fi had a slight meltdown. So hopefully you can at least hear me clearly. I don't know how much you heard of my answer before, but very briefly, there are kind of 5 things that I think I would focus on in terms of recent achievements and how that links both to long-term strategy and to the integration of energy and climate. So the first is around targets, which you may have heard me talking about. So the ambition of targets is absolutely central, and obviously we've set a revised NDC as many other colleagues have, including obviously the EU last week. So ours is at least 68% by 2030, and those are backed by ambitious domestic law as well. And I think that's in terms of the setting of a long-term pathway, that clearly is absolutely critical and a really important focus, not just for us domestically, but of course for COP26 next year. The second, I think, is around climate being central not only to energy policy, but also to policy across the spectrum, and in particular to growth and economic and industrial policy. Not least, of course, because the opportunity to build back better and to build back greener from coronavirus is a unique one. And in particular, given the timing of it, it's one that we collectively need to seize. And I think the most interesting thing for me in the UK, and I think we're seeing this globally as well, is that for quite some time, I think the case for climate action has been articulated not just in terms of in environmental terms or social terms, but also in economic terms. And certainly for us, the growth opportunities from the low carbon transition have been central to climate policy. I think the transition that we're seeing now is the absolutely necessary one, which is not simply growth being central to climate policy, but climate policy being central to growth. And I'll say a little bit more about the things that we're doing about that, but critically important, in particular in the context of a just transition and how we manage that transition, in particular for parts of the country or parts of regions which are highly dependent on fossil fuels and industries associated with fossil fuels, because clearly a transition, not just for those industries, but for those areas and those regions, is going to be absolutely critical to political and social consent for the pace of transition that we need. The third point I'd make is around pathways, and I think the critical importance of pathways for net zero adapted to individual countries and region circumstances. So here in the UK, last week, our Climate Change Committee, that's our independent advisory body, published their advice on our long-term strategy for net zero and the pathways for reaching that. I think that's really critically important for us in terms of identifying both how we get there and in particular what the key choices are in the relatively short term. The one sort of note of caution I have around pathways is that they often show quite significant levels of uncertainty, and one's eye is often drawn to where we end up in 2050. But in fact, of course, that 2050 pathway is really important, but more important, I think, is the fact that almost all the pathways, certainly for the UK, have a lot of commonality in terms of the action that we need to take now. So retaining a really strong focus on what we do in the next 1, 2, 5 and 10 years has to be the critical outcome of any pathway work that we do. And that takes me to my fourth point, which is the commitments on what you're going to do in the short term in order to deliver those pathways and avoid the eye simply being drawn to 2050 as opposed to what we need to do now, which is often tempting. And we recently set out a 10-point plan, setting out some of the actions that we're going to take to put us on that net zero pathway. And that's intended to be comprehensive across the economy. So it includes proposals on power, in offshore wind and so on, in buildings, in transport, in land use, in innovation, and in financing, etc. And I think that the key challenge for the UK, as for governments across the world, is about how do you translate those targets into actions which fit both the requirements that you have in energy and climate terms, but also which fit with your industrial and economic capabilities. And I think it's also important to say that in those actions, the analogy that I frequently use is that this is not an a la carte menu. This is a set menu. We need to do all of those things, and we need to proceed at pace across the board if we're going to tackle this challenge. And then the fifth and final point I would make is around the importance of systems thinking in the way that we develop those pathways. So while we're proud of our decarbonisation record, we've cut emissions by almost half since 1990. That hasn't actually involved a sort of fundamental systemic change in the way that the net zero transition in the next 30 years is going to require systemic change. Because essentially what, a large part of that decarbonisation has been in our power sector. It's been about exchanging large-scale fossil fuel generation for large-scale renewable and low-carbon generation. But the next phase is going to be about how those systems interact with each other, how electricity interacts with heating and with transport, and how, for example, land use interacts with bioenergy and hydrogen production and so on. So our new energy white paper is a really key milestone in that, because it talks not just about the key technologies and the investment models for those technologies, which of course is critically important, but also in terms of how different parts of the energy system interact with one another. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Actually, time flies very quickly. I had like 3 more questions that I wanted to ask, but we are almost very close to the end of the session. I would like to maybe ask your final remark about, so we have chosen your government because you're doing great thing in integrating climate agenda into energy agenda, but it's not always easy for other countries. If you can just give us one recommendation, what's the key success factor in terms of the planning architecture that you developed? What would you recommend for the rest of the country who hasn't submitted the long-term strategy for low emission development? If you can be very brief, that would be appreciated. So may I start with Carlos, please?
Thank you, Asami. Very briefly, so let me open my thought and answer about the question. When we design our policies and our regulatory framework and long-term energy scenarios as well, we take care of listen the industry, private sector, NGOs, other public minister as the Ministry of Environment, of course, transportation, and we work very close with them. We share our assessment and our analysis to improve the decision making and to engage all parties. Robust scenarios require consensus building from many parties and, of course, an important technical foundation. So for us, the key is building collaboration, engagement of our energy policy, because the energy transition is not just for the energy sector. The energy transition, the climate commitments are for the people, and we believe that. We have an energy planning process that we build with participation with the generation companies, the utilities and transmission operators, the ISO, the mining industry, the overall industry with energy consumption. This design of the participation process are in our regulation, and we have rules of participation. We create task forces with energy experts, academics, NGOs. So our energy planning process is an open process. We design and simulate the scenarios with strong technical approaches, but not just inside the Energy Ministry offices. We share, we ask, and listen. This is our recommendation.
Thank you very much for very precise and very strong recommendation. Can I ask Mr. Van Steen for a brief recommendation?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I can be relatively brief, Ross, because I think first of all, what one needs in order to be effective in using these tools for the energy transition, which is at the end of the day what we want to achieve. We're not doing modeling for the sake of modeling, but to have a good basis for taking the right decisions in terms of policy. So I think on that, it is really important that we combine energy and climate modeling. And this might sound obvious, but in fact it isn't. And it's not that long ago that we started to do that in Europe. Before that, these were two separate exercises. And of course, because of the very, very close connections between energy and climate, they have to be done together. So it's not us in the energy department in the Commission who's doing this. This is a team of people from across different departments who are involved in this type of operation. Secondly, I would say you need to have a very clear process. You need to be very transparent. You need to involve stakeholders as far as possible in order to create trust and ownership, so that everybody will have this as a basis also for their discussions. There might be disagreement on certain assumptions in the modeling, which is normal, but at least when the assumptions are clear, you can have a discussion around them. If you are not open about your assumptions, then things start to become much more complicated. I think those are my main recommendations. And of course, it's not easy. I mean, let's not try and pretend that this is simple. It is not simple. It requires quite a lot of work. But once you have it and you can update it, then you have a really good base for policy making that is evidence-based, which is essential at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for very insightful recommendation. So may I ask Mr. Lode for the final remark?
Yeah, thank you. I certainly agree with what my colleagues on the panel have said about, in particular, about the importance of an open process, and secondly, that none of this is easy. I think I'd have two recommendations, but I promise they'll be very brief. I think the first is having an independent, credible advisory body has been really critically important to the debate in the UK. So we have the Committee on Climate Change. It's completely independent. It's established in law. It's not a government body, and I think their ability to take a whole systems view across the entire economy, and secondly, to be able to say things which are frankly harder for governments to say, and in some ways to create the political and the wider space for the open debate that people have talked about to happen, certainly has been critically important for us. The second is about thinking about how the energy transition has to have net zero at its heart, but it is not just about net zero. And actually, there is a much wider transition that's going to happen in this space in the next 30 years, focused around new technology, around data, around improved consumer experience. And actually, certainly for us in the UK, and I think globally, the energy challenge and the transition to net zero will, of course, involve a lot of investment. It'll involve some additional costs, but it can potentially happen at the same time as an energy transition, which is a hugely positive proposition for consumers and for energy users. And by bringing those two things together, I think it is how we can hopefully make progress collectively.
Thank you so much for three distinct speakers for sharing insight with us. So we also appreciate your leadership in your respective governments, and we really look forward to keep working with your government in advancing the global debate towards clean energy transition. And we will actually invite you back for the key takeaway sessions after the panel discussion too for the wrap-up. I understand that Mr. Van Steen need to leave now, but I will be talking to Mr. Baria and Mr. Lode in about 40 minutes. And now with this, thank you again. I now hand it over to Carlos, to Pablo, please.
Thank you, Asami, and thank you to our distinguished panelists. You have all provided valuable insights on how governments are leading in integrating climate and energy agendas. Thank you very much indeed. We had a short break planned for now, but since we are a bit delayed with the timekeeping, we kindly ask you to bear with us and skip the break, and let's continue to our next panel. We will discuss insights from institutions supporting governments with developing net zero scenarios, on challenges and best practices in devising long-term low-emission development strategies. And it is my pleasure to introduce you to our next chair, Ms. Elizabeth Press, Director of Planning and Program Support at IRENA, who represents our agency in climate-related entities and initiatives. Elizabeth, over to you, please.
Thank you, Pablo, very much, and thank you for this wonderful session until now. And I think it has been absolutely amazing introduction for what we need to do in the next 20 minutes or so. So let me just quickly introduce the people in this panel. We have James Grabert, who is the Director of Mitigation Division of the UNFCCC. He's leading the work on market-based approaches to climate change mitigation, and he also has a small portfolio of leading an additional division of communications and engagement. Welcome, James. We have Kelly Levin, who is a Senior Associate of WRI, the World Resources Institute, on the Global Climate Program. And she works on supporting countries in the design and tracking of climate commitments, as well as planning for long-term transitions associated with decarbonizations. She also plays a leading role in WRI on communication with respect to climate science development. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Kelly, because it is not always easy to communicate these things. And finally, we have Richard Barron, who is the Executive Director of 2050 Pathways Platform, a multi-stakeholder initiative of countries, international financial institutions, think tanks and organizations with an interest in developing the Paris Agreement's long-term low-emission development strategies. welcome to all of you, and we will go straight into questions. There was a very rich input from the national, or in the context of the EU, the regional perspective, but I wanted to ask you, given your work and given the big picture that you have, and going from the big picture, zooming back in international strategies, how do you see the key success factors in aligning these two seemingly separate but highly interconnected strategies around long-term energy scenarios and low emission development scenarios? And I'm going to also ask you to complicate the matter a little bit further. So we now have not only alignment of the NDC strategies with the long-term strategies 2050 and beyond, but also have the COVID situation, which also gives a new opening in this regard. So can you just give us your initial views around how we can, what are the best practices around these issues, and how we can reconcile these different strategies in the short term? So let me start with James. James, we can't see you. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, I'm just I'm trying to figure this out. I hope I don't cut off, but you can hear me at least, I hope. So best practices, let me say three things, I guess, I would like to highlight. The role of long-term scenarios, the governance frameworks, and policy peer learning are three things I think I will focus on. Let me start with the role of the long-term scenarios themselves. While some stakeholders may not be quite ready to, let's say, change the way they do things and change the business as usual, we have to think about these scenarios as informing us to help foresee long-term implications of decisions today. I mean, it seems obvious, I guess, that's what, the purpose, but I think reminding ourselves of that and ensuring we're applying that as a best practice. I mean, the most obvious, obviously, is fossil fuel exploration, for example. We can generate revenue at the moment, but what is it going to look like in the future? We're most likely going to suffer from serious revenue loss in the long term. As we move towards a net zero future. So good scenarios and good scenario planning helps inform us and think about these things in advance, and to what extent these changes are happening and when they're happening. In this regard, of course, sectoral level scenario planning is really important in identifying the technologies, the investment needs, the policies, and also let's not forget the policies and the supports needed for the socio-economic transition issues. That is very, very important for many countries. So on the second point, in terms of what makes a success or what is best practice, is the governance frameworks. I think a number of countries have legislation to require the government. I think we just heard Tim speaking about some of that. We have legislation for governments to report progress in the midterm and long term on an annual basis, for example. In addition, these countries have advisory councils, independent advisory councils, as we've heard, to evaluate the planning. And these accountability mechanisms are key. I mean, and they encourage governments to feel confident that they can move forward, and it allows them to be able to review short-term actions and helps to depoliticize things, let's say. It's very important. There's also the high-level political leadership as part of the governance, and inclusivity of stakeholder dialogues. Those two things are also incredibly important. It generates the awareness. What are the necessary steps in the short term? It helps to mainstream the long-term climate objectives into the short-term policies and actions and the sectoral and subnational activities. And the third thing I would mention is I want to touch upon the policy peer learning. Innovative policy and business practices have and will arise in multiple areas to deal with and reconcile the short-term costs and align itself with long-term benefits, such as reducing the price of solar PV through auctions. So these practices in high-income countries, however, may not be directly applied to middle-income countries in different regions. The UNFCCC specifically is planning to provide further support to countries through our regional collaboration centers to develop and implement their long-term strategies and enhance the sector-level mitigation actions to help address this peer learning and peer learning that's relevant and applicable. So I'll stop at that, but those are just three thoughts I would have to address your question. Thank you.
James, very much. Kelly, can I ask you the same question, please?
Sure, thanks so much, and thanks for including me in this panel, and it's been a terrific day so far. I think what we heard clearly from this first panel, that there are a few elements that would certainly help to bring these two very important planning documents together. I think first is, we know that from the LTS that a number of different countries are actually modeling a number of different scenarios that look specifically at different assumptions around the energy sector. And different technology pathways. We heard that from the EU this right beforehand as well. And certainly building in an independent analysis. So I think there's something about the role in terms of exploring possible pathways and implications, which can kind of bring a broader systems view to connect the dots between these two planning processes. We also know that some of the long-term strategies note the explicit connection between a longer-term energy plan and the long-term strategy. So if you look at South Africa's long-term strategy, for example, it references its 2019 integrated resource plan, which is also based on a long-term emissions trajectory. South Africa has this peak plateau decline trajectory. And the LTS notes that further updates to that integrated resource plan will need to be take into account any of the future modifications of the emissions trajectory. So there's kind of this two-way communication, which I think is going to be really critical. And some of the LTS, what we see is that it notes that it actually isn't aligned yet. So if you look at Finland, for example, it notes that there's a possibility that the energy modeling that was included in the long-term strategy for a net zero target could establish it could exceed the established targets that are in its long-term energy planning, Finland's national energy and climate strategy. So I think we're starting to see some of those connections and related, and we heard this from the first panel, really making sure that we're bringing a review process into the long-term strategy as well as into the long-term energy planning. If you look, for example, at Fiji's long-term strategy, it recommends a review and update of the national energy policy as a result of the long-term strategy. And we heard actually 2 days ago that there was a public consultation on the national energy policy there. We heard from the EU this morning, just right before this, about the need for a revision process, a review process for establishing trust. And I guess lastly, just to note that, and I think a few of the other speakers have touched upon this, this is much bigger than an emissions trajectory. This is going to require a very significant transformation. And I think just devoting greater attention to the policy development, the institutional reforms that would be needed to ease that transition, and especially just in terms of what those transitions really imply for people. So thanks, I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Kelly. A very important point, emphasizing the structural shift that has to take place as a result of ongoing transformation. Richard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And let me start by wholeheartedly agreeing with what James Grabert and Kelly Levin just said. If you could go back maybe one slide, please. I wanted to start by maybe showing a bit of the slide after that then, sorry about that. To show you a picture about where we are in terms of long-term strategies, the ones that have been released and the ones that we, the 2050 Pathways Platform, are aware of are going to be coming out. So indeed, quite a few, and a great deal actually came through since the beginning of this year, with a lot of them actually going for net zero, which is very encouraging. And you see on this map that there are many more to come, but there's still a lot of spots in these areas that are in fact void. And I'd like to go back to the one other slide, please, which is the slide that shows the countries that have actually committed one way or another, either at head of state or make aspirational declarations to go for net zero. And you can tell that there's a number of countries here that have such aspirations that are in fact not even starting the work on long-term strategies. Some of the countries, and certainly G20, have the means to elaborate their emission and policy pathways, including on renewables, but many have yet to develop a blueprint for net zero. So it's absolutely critical that we provide them first with the planning tools to explore what net zero might mean for them and link this to policy or infrastructure development plans. among others, we're working with development banks and MDBs as well to make these long-term strategies a more central part of how these institutions will align with the Paris Agreement, and therefore help countries help themselves, if you will, with those planning tools, in which I believe the long-term energy scenarios will have to play an absolutely critical part and is missing still in many ways. So I would really look forward to working closer to the LTES network to see what extent the role can be played there. So the other thing I would like to say is that it's not enough to look at the long-term strategies as documents. We think of them as processes, and all those dynamics that the previous speakers spoke about new technologies coming in, surprises on cost. Just recently, a surge of activity and interest in hydrogen, for instance, including green hydrogen, as we heard from Chile. All these elements have to be brought and update the long-term strategy as we go. So the planning is not a one-off, especially since we're looking to 2050, and it will be quite critical to work on the robustness of the scenarios once countries decide that this is the way they want to go. I would just like to point out that there are countries like Peru who are starting to do this by bringing together a range of policymakers and stakeholders to figure out what is the range of assumptions that they make, where is it that they disagree, to figure out what is the most robust way through policy means to achieve the collective goal and to remain consistent with everybody's views around the table. So there's also innovations that are being picked up on the planning side of long-term strategies that I think can be brought to bear in the energy planning as well.
Thank you very much, Richard. And I find it absolutely fascinating how we now talk about the net zero strategies as if this was something that everybody is involved in and everybody was convinced about, and it really is something that is a recent discussion and has become mainstream in recent years, which is a phenomenal achievement and progress in the context of a Paris strategy. So I wanted to ask you whether, and maybe we can start with Kelly this time, and I'll go to James and then Richard. Kelly, what do you see in terms of how these net zero scenarios are evolving, and what are kind of the key components, and what are the implications for energy in this regard?
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. I think it's really a tremendous momentum we're seeing around net zero targets at the country, subnational level, corporate level, and I think there are a few kind of key differences that we're seeing in the net zero targets. Some of it has to do with, as Richard's slide showed, kind of the level of commitment of where that net zero target sits. Is it in a law? Is it in a policy document? Is it in a heads of state speech? Or is it part of some broader participation in a coalition? So a key question in terms of how it's inscribed within a particular government's policy. I think also we're seeing some differences in terms of the details of net zero targets, anywhere from the sectors and greenhouse gases covered to the role of carbon markets, if it's explicit, to the assumptions around carbon removal. And we heard a little bit about that in the first few presentation, and the very significant implications that will have on sectoral decarbonization strategies. And certainly we're seeing some divergence also in terms of the coupling of short-term commitments and net zero targets. And that's going to be really critical to ensure that, to the extent that net zero targets really actually have teeth at the end of the day and don't kind of sit on the shelf, that they actually influence everyday decision-making, it's going to be really critical that they also translate to greater ambition in the shorter term. In terms of the energy sector specifically, I think there are a few key attributes that we know in terms of what a net zero target pathway would look like. We just put out a state of climate action report with the Climate Works Foundation that basically looked at 21 indicators, many of which touched upon the energy sector, that were aligned with a 1.5 trajectory for 2030 and 2050. And only 2 had a rate of historical change that was commensurate with the rate of change that would be required for 2030 or 2050. So we need very significant acceleration. And specifically in terms of the energy sector, our report found that the share of renewables in electricity generation would have to accelerate by a factor of 5 by 2030. the share of unabated coal in electricity generation would move from 38% today down to somewhere between 0 and 3% in 2018. The renovation rate of the world's buildings moving from 1 to 2% now to 2.5 to 3.5% in a decade. We see, significant needs for electrifying industry. The share of low carbon fuels in the transport sector, for example, jumping up from 4% today to 15% in 2030 to 70 to 95% by 2050. So these are some, tremendous accelerations. But the good news is that we know this can happen. We've seen it time and again with technology kind of building up this S-curve, but it needs to be kind of properly nurtured by policies and incentives.
Thank you. And I just before I go to James on this, and James specifically because you come from the global perspective, like ourselves, there are a lot of conversations that we are having. It's really concentrated around the global north, and that there was quite a few comments in the chat that I had seen that also talk about aspects of global solidarity and the ability of developing countries to actually have a similar approach to net zero strategies. So can I ask you the same questions, but also maybe if you can reflect a little bit, what does this mean for countries, the developing countries?
Yes, I'll try to do that. Let me speak it first to answer your question more generally, and then on your additional point. I was going to focus on the timing element, with respect to net zero emissions and implications for energy. We've heard a number of governments and stakeholders have committed now to net zero by mid-century, by 2050 or slightly after, et cetera. We have 120 governments that signed up for the Climate Ambition Alliance when we were in Madrid last year, at COP25, with a commitment to reach this net zero state. Which we all know is aligned with what the IPC has been telling us in terms of the 1.5 report. So we need to get there, and the countries seem to say they're going to get there. But what does it really mean for energy? How is that? What are these scenarios going to look like? What does that look like for energy? I guess this was the basis of your question. My assessment is in terms of the timing element. I wanted to focus on it has to be before 2050. The energy sector, as we know and discussed already today, they have the technologies, tools, the capacities. It's possible. From that point of view, from a sectoral perspective, and I say this also because we know we can move towards electricity generation from the zero emission sources. We know we're making advances in power storage, electrification of end-use sectors. We can make further advances in energy efficiency, and a lot of governments are starting to invest in these new technologies. Some are looking at hydrogen. And this is all going to become affordable and possible. So I think there's an expectation that energy has to move, in essence, fast, and faster probably than mid-century if possible, of course. On the other hand, there are those sectors that aren't going to move as fast. And when you play that off against what we're talking about in terms of energy, steel, cement, agricultural, we need to still find several solutions for that to get us to there. We need to reduce, methane, for example, from livestock and rice fields, but we have a growing world population. We already have a significant world population. We have to be able to sustainably continue to produce the goods and the products needed, but we need solutions. So where that leads me is that, while we need energy to move faster, it's also another reason is why, because we need to know what do we have in terms of the balance, the removals element, and what remains the gap. Even if we do advance on energy, there are other sectors that aren't going to build advance, and we have to see how much of this gap we have and what are we doing on the equalization side to reach the net zero. So in conclusion, it's about the timing, it's about the advancements, and I think we're seeing some good signals. I think at the Ambition Summit just the other day, Kazakhstan, who has, I believe, the 5th largest oil reserve, has said it's going to go net zero. So it'd be very interesting if we see more fossil fuel rich countries stepping up now and saying that can really, I think, solidify the fact that energy can do this quick or quicker, let's say. So I wanted to focus on that. Now, your question about what it means for the rest of the world, or say, those countries and a balanced and fair and common but differentiated approaches, etc. Well, we have markets. To some extent, I think the cooperative approaches that are defined in Paris should help us get there. It doesn't mean that, energy doesn't have to move at a similar pace in all countries, but I do understand that not all countries will be in the same position to really move their energy sector in the same way. But I do think as the developed world moves, the rest of the world will move, because energy is something that, it's a global market. But I do think there's an element, to answer your question, of using the cooperative approaches, the mechanisms, the markets. Yeah, that's how I would see it could fit in. Hope that addresses your concerns. Thanks.
Thanks, James. It's actually not a concern. It's just that we actually have a fantastic opportunity with the focus on renewables and the way that the markets are moving and becoming more affordable. And because of the decentralized nature, there is a great opportunity for leapfrogging and the potential to basically reinvent the energy system in the global south that is a lot harder to decarbonize in the north. So I think there is a phenomenal opportunity here. And so I'm going to just hand over to Richard to address the same question.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I noticed, and this is natural, we're focusing on the energy sector transformation here, but I wanted to pick on the example that James Graber just brought up of Kazakhstan, and think about other many developing countries who also are or have been so far relying on fossil fuel exports to actually fuel, so to speak, a big part of their economy. And so that diversification of their economies is also something that we'll have to address, and on which renewable may also play a part. I think we see that in the example from Chile, talking about using their resources to become a clean energy exporter, but definitely something that will be on the mind of those countries front and central. We've seen actually a lot of convergence on the key pillars of what we call deep decarbonization, if you will, on how to get there to net zero. And that is largely, and no surprises to most of the people on this call, but useful to remind, decarbonizing electricity, key role here. Energy efficiency and resource efficiency improvements have to play a huge role to avoid having too much of a growing demand for energy supply. Electrification of end users, of course, and carbon sinks. So these have been 4 pillars that we've been talking about a lot, but I think there's some refinements that come into this discussion now. There is the difficult discussion around how do you, trade between various users for land when it comes to sinks or biomass-based renewable energy for electricity or chemicals. These will be important questions, and this is where scenarios play a huge role to figure out what's feasible and not feasible. The role of hydrogen also as another decarbonized fuel is something that wasn't so visible, I believe, 10 years ago. And in the last couple of years, with new projects coming on, new infrastructure being built, we heard about Chile, but Morocco is another one, and there'll be more coming, might change the picture a little bit about what our decarbonization scenarios look like. Where there is less clarity, I would agree with James, is even though there are some net zero emissions solutions, is in industry, heavy industry in particular, with different options that are emerging here and there, different technology bets that different countries are making as well with their own innovation, R&D, public procurement policies. So we have to watch that picture as it emerges, because this is also a key component of some of the infrastructure that needs still to be built in a lot of developing countries. Many roads to be built, many railways, many cities and buildings, and we have to make sure that the right materials and technologies will be made available for that. I think the other blind spots that we need to look into further as well are around circular economy and sectoral coupling that was mentioned a couple of times during the day. These are new themes that have to be integrated more, because I believe they bring great opportunities as well, but are not fully explored in our exercises so far. Over.
Thank you, Richard, very much. And we have 7 minutes left, so I want to have another quick round just on one question that I felt nobody really addressed. You know, when IRENA issued the report on post-COVID recovery, and what we did, we basically looked at a 2050. We took our 2050 scenario, the global renewables outlook, and kind of walked back to 2030, the SDG timeline, and walked back to the next 3 years, basically the recovery period, to see what are the priority areas where the investment needs to happen in order to shift the energy transition towards this 2050 strategy. So what would be your quick recommendation or advice or highlight of how the governments can use this next 3 years to make this shift in their planning? How can they mainstream this? How can they use this very unique moment in time to make this adjustment that would reconcile the seeming inconsistencies between energy and climate plans? So I'm not going to call on anybody because this is kind of coming out of, so anybody who wants to volunteer, we have 5 minutes left. Just raise your hand and please address the question. There we go, James.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I mean, I actually recollect we had a conversation, what was it, three months ago? We're here in Bonn together, we talk a lot about these things. And we're like, okay, we're not seeing what we need to see in this COVID recovery. We're not seeing the money going in the right places. And, you know, I remember talking, it's okay, there has to be a moment where we say, okay, that was the initial response. Now they have to, you know, double down and really do it right. And that's the moment now, I think. I think with all this good news we're seeing on increased ambition, on need to go net zero, this is a moment also for the countries. Okay, see, look, we can do it. And all what we're going to do in terms of the energy part of the COVID recovery now has to be aligned to that. So I think it's an opportunity. And I think we, you know, those of us who've been working on this COVID work and trying to assess what's happening across countries needs to push harder. That has to happen now. It can't be, you know, less than half of whatever the funds or something like that are going in the right direction. This has to change. And I think this is an opportunity that's before us right now in this period of time.
Richard.
Yeah, just in a few words, I think the net zero commitments are becoming, and those signals are coming strong and quite overwhelming. We work with countries who are not quite there yet, but they see that their major export markets are going to go in this direction and have to somewhat adjust, you know, the tone of their economy, of their future investment and sectoral developments towards what future markets hold for them. And so we have to grab that signal and say, these are not separate discussions, to say, don't make the wrong investments again now. And it is our duty to actually say this will be a waste of money if this is where it's going. We see still 50% more going into fossil fuels support than going into renewables. Arguably, renewables have gotten cheaper, so this is going a long way, but yet that money is not well spent when it goes to fossil fuels. And we have to make the net zero objective more visible, recognizing that for some of the countries, this is not a goal that they can embrace now. They still have a lot to do on their development and on the recovery in particular, and there are pressing issues to be addressed there. Nonetheless, for new investments, it's also the duty of development banks to make sure they align fully with what it seems to be recognized as the right response to the climate emergency, and that is net zero.
Thanks. Any last comment, Kelly, quickly? Thanks.
Sure, thanks. I think just to build on James and Richard's comment, I think there is an opportunity here also from a governance perspective to bring processes together. You know, what's interesting, as Richard's map showed also, is that a lot of these net zero targets are coming from heads of state, but those that are kind of working to operationalize that may be completely separate from the decisions that are being taken on the recovery processes. So to bring these processes together from a head of state level as well, I think is critical. And then also to do really arm with the type of modeling and analysis that shows both the benefits and the significant losses if we don't take these conversations together, if we make the wrong investments today.
Thank you very much. And let me just invite Mr. Tim Lord, Carlos Varia, and Professor Shukla to rejoin the panel so that we can have the last few minutes together and have a discussion. Can I ask you to turn your cameras? Okay, I see you here. I see your name. So let me just hold on the Professor Shukla first. You gave us a very interesting overview from the scientific viewpoint where we are. And can you give us your reflection, having heard the views and insights from governments and from international organizations and the institutions dealing with this? So can you give us your reflection on their inputs? Oh, we cannot hear very well, Professor Shukla. All right, let me go to somebody else while we resolve the communication issues. Mr. Lord, you have, quite a few reflections refer to what you were talking about in terms of structural change and the need for alignment of different strategies. So can you round back to what you have heard from colleagues in the second panel?
Yeah, certainly. So I thought a really interesting discussion, and I think I'd really strongly agree with the fact that it is worth reflecting on how extraordinary it is that we're talking in these terms about net zero as a goal that is really has a huge amount of across the world. And having been involved in this area for many years, as I'm sure lots of people on the call have, it is extraordinary and very encouraging that we're talking in these terms. I think two things really, both related to delivery and actually how not simply kind of what does the pathway look like and what do the charts look like and what are your kind of technology deployment goals, etc. But how do you actually make this happen? I think first of all, I kind of really strongly agree with I think what Kelly was saying about first of all the importance of real and practical action to deliver all of this, and secondly the importance of it being driven absolutely from the top and from kind of head of state level in terms of the integration of climate strategy and climate requirements with energy requirements and then broader economic recovery and from coronavirus, because I think climate, inevitably is an all-encompassing challenge for the next 30 years and no doubt well beyond that as well. Clearly, a lot of that action needs to be bottom up and localized, but I think that central direction is absolutely critical. I think the second point I'd make on delivery, because it's quite interesting that when we have these conversations, we very rarely talk about the practicality of delivering this stuff. But what we've talked about today, when we sort of quantify the investment requirements around all of this, and simply, for us in the UK, we have 30 million buildings roughly that we need to decarbonize. We've got 30 years to do it. That's 1 million a year. That's a lot of buildings to get to zero carbon in that time. Now, that's an enormous opportunity in terms of the investment that's going to be needed to do that and the way that that can drive jobs and growth. But I think it's really important for countries, and certainly this is something that we're working on and increasingly focused on, is about actually how are you going to make that happen? Where are the raw materials coming from? Where are your supply chains? Do you have the right skills in the economy, and how can you ideally transfer some of the resources, labour resources and wider resources from what are currently fossil fuel dependent or fossil fuel extractive industries into those supply chains of the future? Because I fear that that there is a scenario where everyone is very focused on delivering net zero, very committed to it, but we simply don't have the capability to deliver it in terms of the volume that's required. And I think certainly as we move through the next year, obviously there'll be a lot of talk about targets, and that's absolutely right, but we also need to be making sure that we're talking about the practical delivery of all of this and how we can do that not just on a national level but also globally.
Thank you very much. Do we have a Professor Shukla with us? Yeah, I don't see him yet. Meanwhile, let me just ask Kelly. I want to get back to you on something that you do for a living, and just linking to what Mr. Lord just said. How do you communicate some of these things to people who actually need to be part of it? Because the energy transition or transition to net zero and beyond energy really requires everybody to understand what it is, understand what their role is, and come along. So what are some of the strategies that you think are good to communicate this message?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think a real challenge for this community for two reasons. One is that some of this conversation, especially what we're focusing on today, is necessarily long term, and it's really quite difficult to understand how that's going to impact any one of us. I think it's interesting that this conversation has kind of moved us away from I think just a few years ago, we were so focusing on end of century. Now we've kind of brought it up to mid-century. So we're starting to paint a picture of what mid-century looks like. But we really do need to also talk about what that means in the next few years as well, to make this kind of concrete to people. The second major challenge is that often we're talking in metrics that don't resonate with people. Either whether it's kind of, amount of renewable energy supply or emissions, it's just hard to kind of grasp. So I think the exercise also of translating this into metrics that are understandable is going to be really key. And also kind of painting, I think we need kind of more storytelling in this community of painting the picture of what this world looks like in terms of the benefits that will come alongside, and also the challenges inherent in not taking that pathway, which often are not really kind of articulated in means that people can understand. So I think just kind of a combination of more storytelling, more kind of tangible metrics, and bringing this kind of closer in time frame to timeframes that really kind of resonate with people's decision making would be really helpful.
James, maybe the same question to you, because you have a very large climate community within your realm, and that community is growing because you have the climate action now attached to the UNFCCC processes. So how do we mainstream some of these messages across?
I don't know if I have the answer, but I think some answers, I don't have the answer, but sorry, it's my dog barking there. I think in terms of what we're doing with the climate action portfolio, working at a sectoral level, what we're trying to do with the pathways and the supporting the champions and the race to zero, I think those tools can be very powerful because they communicate both to the broad base individuals, to consumers, but they also can communicate to the parties about what they need to do and how that these things in terms of developing the policies fit into what they're doing in long-term strategies and NDCs. So that's what I would think is the immediate possibility in terms of building that understanding and communicating it in a way that is, as I said, both communicating to the individuals, to the broader community, but also to the governments. Hope that helps.
Thanks, James. And I think we're still having difficulties connecting the professor. And so can I go back to Mr. Lord as well, to link, to kind of go back to the discussion. There were quite a few questions in the audience around the support to developing countries and how to strengthen the capability and capacity of developing countries to develop sound net zero strategies. So you have, as the UK, you obviously have a large program, global program of global solidarity, but also your COP26 chair. So if you can reflect a little bit, how can we have a more inclusive way in bringing everybody along in this, regardless of geographical, economic, or otherwise differences?
Yeah, sure. So I think clearly a hugely important set of questions. I mean, I think first of all, it's incredibly important for for the global north and for countries which obviously bear a lot of responsibility for the concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere to show leadership in terms of target setting, etc., and to take their share of responsibility. And certainly, that's what we're trying to do through our revised nationally determined contribution, and that's certainly what we're keen to see others do, and delighted. And that we are seeing many others do as well. I think secondly, obviously, the role of climate finance in terms of delivering decarbonisation on the ground in developing economies is critically important. But I think it's also important to say, first of all, the role that in particular the more developed economies and larger economies can play in driving down the costs of some of these technologies and showing leadership in terms of bearing some of those early costs. As those technologies come down the price curve, I think it's important that we take that responsibility. Obviously, we've been trying to do that. You can't do, no one country I think can do that for every technology. We've been trying to do that with offshore wind, and a lot of the learnings that we've had in the UK, we hope obviously will be exploited in other parts of the world as well. But I think the other thing is about how we enable And I think this is a really challenging problem. And I think it's something obviously that is being worked on as we build towards the COP, how we work on kind of global markets and the global price of carbon and where the economies in the global north can work more closely with developing economies in terms of developing that market and enabling those economies to continue to grow at rapid pace, to reflect the fact that their populations will be growing as well, in order to hopefully deliver decarbonisation at lower cost. I think just the one last point I'd make is obviously one of the concerns that many countries have is about the kind of cost of this transition, and there is a cost and there's a lot of investment required. But certainly the analysis we're doing on our energy system is fascinating to me, having done lots of this over the last 10 years, is that what we're seeing now is actually that the net zero electricity system in 2050 is the cheap system. So no matter, even if you don't care about carbon emissions, you're still going to have a very, very low carbon energy system in 2050 anyway. And I think that has obviously huge implications for the global transition. It has challenges as well as opportunities. But I think looking ahead to that sort of timeline and focusing on it can be quite influential in strategies, not just in the global north, but in the global south as well.
Thank you very much. I'm going to use the last few minutes that we have to have another round of questions with the three of you, because we cannot get hold of the as far as I can understand from my colleagues. So Kelly, let me start with you, and it's a little bit linked to what we just discussed in the context of the larger global, the need to actually have many stakeholders along. And how do you see that we can actually bring along to this sort of forward-looking net zero scenario planning those who will be adversely affected by this shift and by this change? What do you think would be effective strategies at the national and global levels to bring them along?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a critical question and one that needs to be front and center in terms of any planning process for these longer term transitions, to make sure that the measures that are put in place are done so in a way that allows for a just transition for those that will be the most adversely impacted. I think, I think first there's an analysis and modeling component of this that's really essential in terms of showing the implications of different scenarios on different jobs, for example, as well as costs or prices, and showing that transparently. And then using those in stakeholder dialogue with those that are most adversely impacted, some of which are closely tied to a fossil fuel economy. And hearing, I think, also from those communities in terms of what an ideal transition pathway would look like for them. And I remember here in the United States, there was a discussion several years ago about financial payments for those that are most adversely impacted. But instead, what was quite clear was training and new jobs was, a much greater priority that would be much more sustainable. I think until those communities that are going to be most adversely impacted are going to be brought into those dialogues, it's really hard to design those measures that would rectify these impacts of transitions. And then, I think working hand in hand with public comment periods to be able to design those measures to ensure a just transition would be really important, working with those that would be most adversely impacted.
Thank you, Kelly. And you bring a very important point. We're talking about this from a global perspective, and we all sort of aligned in what we are thinking. But when you break it down at the national level, even subnational level and individual level, things become very different. I mean, we at IRENA, we have our global membership. Obviously, we work with so many countries, and working with them on the planning and the capacity building in that regard, and you see all the nuances of what is the local circumstances and how diverse and different these dialogues are, the discussions are, and how different the needs and abilities are across the globe. James, I'm sure you have a similar experience in this regard. What are your views on this?
Yeah, no, I agree with the things Kelly says. I won't add. I just want to add to that, and that's another element is the government planning, and particularly, let's say at the subnational level, in terms of urban planning, in terms of transport planning, in terms of economic planning, often can be done in a way that it feels that it's perhaps removed from this long-term energy planning, for example, or somewhat removed, and it's not, because ultimately, for example, when we've been trying to deal with the transport issue in developing countries in the last decades, it comes down to access to economic activity. And if you don't do this right, you are exacerbating the problem in terms of the just transition. So that policy planning across all areas really has to look at and be integrated into whatever these long-term strategies are, for example, for energy. It's not that removed as it may seem. And that's important that the governments understand the policy planning in terms of local planning and things has a huge impact on people when it's going to be amplified by these other changes. So just stop at that. Thanks.
Thank you, James. And let me ask Mr. Lord for the last reflection on this.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that, and the point in particular about the integration of energy planning and kind of wider net zero transition with local infrastructure, because I think the point that Kelly makes is absolutely critically important about how do we paint a picture for people about what the world is going to look like and how it can look better. And actually, the investment that needs to be made in local communities, in better buildings, in better transport infrastructure, in better community amenities and facilities. And also the fact, this doesn't have to mean, sort of going back to, it doesn't mean everyone having to become a vegetarian or everyone having to stop moving around or ever flying or any of those kinds of things. I think that point about painting a picture about people's local communities in a way that they can understand and visualize, and which is actually a positive vision, is absolutely key to making these transitions a reality.
Thank you very much. And let me just clear it. There is nothing wrong with being vegetarian.
No, nothing wrong.
Thank you so very much for your insights and for sharing your time with us. And it was absolutely amazing to listen to a conversation, but also to read the chat on the side. It was, and I really thank everybody who was actively participating in our discussions. I was reading, and I'm sure I know that other colleagues were reading as well. Very, very insightful and interesting comments on the side. I thank you again for your participation, and I'm going to hand over to Dolph Gillen for closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elizabeth. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers, the panelists, the moderators, and the audience, which was also very active in the chat, for what was a very fruitful and interesting discussion. I have three main takeaways. First of all, that UNFCCC and IRENA are going to collaborate more closely as institutions, but also with all their members, on bringing together the long-term energy scenarios and the long-term emission and development scenarios. Second, we invite countries to join the LTES network, and it's also open, of course, to national planning offices that develop the scenarios. And a third point I wanted to make is this discussion will continue after the break, because 18 to 21 January is the IRENA assembly, our most important event in the year. And this year on the 18th will be Global Energy Transition Day, with a number of interesting discussions around this theme. With that, I hand back to Pablo.
Yes, thank you very much. We've reached the end of the event, and I think there's nothing else to say rather than thank you very much. Keep tuning in for IRENA's work with UNFCCC, and a special call for the government planners that have joined us to join the LTES network. You can reach us at LTES@IRENA.org. Thank you very much for joining.